Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something that is, honestly, absolutely fascinating. The staggering, absolute dominance of the US dollar in global geopolitics. If you've ever stopped to wonder why a single currency holds so much incredible sway over the entire planet, well, you are definitely in the right place. We're going to break down the mechanics, the history, and the sheer power of the dollar, and look at how this one piece of paper literally touches almost every single aspect of your daily life.
So let's just jump straight into this massive, high-stakes question. Why does the US dollar control the world? I mean, really think about it. It's not just about boring economics. We are talking about absolute geopolitical leverage. The source material we're exploring today outlines this reality where global trade, international relations, and even national security are all just tightly wrapped around this one currency. So how on earth did the entire globe become so utterly dependent on it?
Well, to really grasp the sheer weight of that dependency, you have to look at what happens when a country actually tries to challenge it. The source material highlights some pretty intense historical claims, basically that defying the dollar is practically synonymous with defying a superpower. For instance, the sources point out that when Iraq's Saddam Hussein decided to stop using the dollar and move to the euro for oil trades, or when Libya's Gaddafi proposed a unified African currency backed by gold, the ultimate results were regime change and some severely heavy geopolitical consequences. Now, neutrally reporting on these historical claims, the sources essentially suggest that stepping away from the dollar system carries immense and often catastrophic risk for a nation's leadership.
Okay, let's rewind a bit. Before the dollar, the British pound sterling was the undisputed king of the hill. But then World War I happened and it completely bankrupted the UK, forcing them into massive, crushing debt. While Europe was busy fighting, the US was actively supplying weapons and resources, basically hoarding wealth in the process. So, by the time World War II ended, the global financial system was completely in ruins, and the stage was perfectly set for the United States to just swoop in and seize the financial throne. And when I say they seized the throne, I mean they held all the leverage. By the end of World War II, because the US had been selling all those supplies to war-torn nations, they had amassed a mind-blowing 22,000 tons of gold. Just to put that into perspective, that was literally 70% of the entire world's gold reserves. The rest of the globe combined held only 30%. With Europe and Asia economically devastated and completely tapped out of gold, the US held the ultimate trump card to completely dictate the new rules of global finance.
So, holding that ultimate trump card, the U.S. brought 34 countries together at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, back in 1944. With all these global economies in ruins and in desperate need to rebuild, the U.S. proposed a surprisingly simple solution. They basically said, look, we hold the vast majority of the gold, so why don't you all just peg your currencies to our U.S. dollar, rather than directly to gold? This massive agreement also birthed the IMF and the World Bank, which ensured that massive rebuilding loans, like the famous Marshall Plan, were distributed and, importantly, had to be repaid exclusively in U.S. dollars.
But you've got to wonder, why would all these countries just blindly trust American paper? Well, it came down to a rock-solid, ironclad guarantee, and the magic number was 35. The U.S. pledged that $35 could always, without fail, be exchanged for exactly 1 ounce of gold. This gave the entire world a tangible anchor. They weren't just holding paper anymore. They really believed they were holding a perfectly safe voucher for physical gold.
But, promises in geopolitics, they don't always last. By 1971, the US had essentially printed way more dollars than they actually had gold to back up. Other nations started getting really nervous and demanded their physical gold back. So, facing a total drain of their reserves, President Richard Nixon went on television and delivered this massive blow, which we now call the Nixon shock. He completely suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Just like that, overnight, the world was left holding unbacked paper. It was kind of like holding a signed check only to be told the bank account had been permanently closed.
So suddenly, without that gold backing, the dollar was basically in freefall. The U.S. needed a miracle pivot to save its currency, and they found it right in the deserts of the Middle East. They orchestrated what we now call the petrodollar masterstroke. The U.S. approached Saudi Arabia with a pretty incredible offer. America would provide unmatched military security, state-of-the-art weapons, and oil extraction technology. And in exchange, Saudi Arabia had to do just one thing: price and sell all of its global oil exclusively in U.S. dollars.
What this did was create this brilliant, inescapable loop. Think about it. Every single country on Earth needs oil, right? Which meant they now had to buy it in dollars. Because of this, oil-producing nations were suddenly flooded with massive surpluses of U.S. cash. And what did they do with it? Well, they were highly encouraged to reinvest it right back into U.S. Treasury bonds in the American economy. This self-perpetuating loop basically forced every nation to maintain massive US dollar reserves just to keep their lights on and their economies running.
Now, this total financial lock-in, it didn't just stay a brilliant economic strategy. It actually evolved into a literal weapon of economic warfare. Enter the SWIFT network. So SWIFT is the global messaging system that banks use to securely transfer money across borders. While it's nominally this international thing, our source material highlights that the U.S. effectively wields indirect control over it. Being disconnected from SWIFT means a country simply cannot import goods, export products, or receive funding. It's literally been described as dropping a financial nuclear bomb, which is a weapon we've seen utilized with totally devastating effect against nations like Russia and Iran.
This weaponization is largely enforced through what we call sanctions. Let's start with primary sanctions. This is when the U.S. government legally bans its own companies, its financial institutions, and its citizens from doing any business whatsoever with a targeted country. And because the U.S. economy is just so massive, when American money and corporate presence vanish overnight, the targeted nation's stock market instantly crashes. Foreign investment completely dries up because everyone is scrambling to avoid U.S. anger. But honestly, the real knockout punch? That's secondary sanctions. These dictate that any foreign nation or company that dares to trade with a sanctioned country will also face U.S. sanctions. The source gives a really great example of this. India wanted to buy cheap oil from Iran, which obviously would have been hugely beneficial for the Indian economy. However, because of U.S. secondary sanctions against Iran, India was essentially forced to stop buying that oil. They simply couldn't risk losing their own access to the U.S.-controlled global financial system.
Now, as you can imagine, seeing this immense, completely unchecked power has actually terrified a lot of other nations. If their entire economy can just be shut off overnight by Washington, they are incredibly vulnerable. And this fear has sparked a growing movement known as de-dollarization. It's basically this brewing global rebellion where major economies, places like China, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa, are actively looking for ways to reduce their dependency on the US dollar before they potentially become targets of these aggressive financial weapons themselves.
So, fast forward to today's geopolitical landscape. On one side, you have the reigning champ, the US dollar, deeply woven into the fabric of global trade. But on the other side, potential alternatives are definitely rising. We're seeing some major shifts right now, like Saudi Arabia and Iraq actually beginning to settle some of their oil trades in the Chinese yuan. On top of that, the BRICS nations, so that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are actively exploring a shared weighted currency to bypass the dollar entirely. Which brings us to the million-dollar or maybe trillion-dollar question. Will the US dollar ever actually lose its global throne? The source material makes it pretty clear that untangling the world from the dollar is a monumental, incredibly difficult task, especially given how deeply entrenched it is in global systems like SWIFT and the whole oil trade. And yet, the seeds of a rebellion are undoubtedly taking root. So can a coalition of nations truly dethrone the financial empire of the United States? Or is the power of the dollar simply too absolute to break? It is a fascinating geopolitical chess match, for sure. I hope this explainer has given you a clearer lens through which to view it all. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning the systems that run our world.